In the summer of 1937, the Spanish Civil War arrived in a string of ordinary farming villages and left almost none of them standing. Some were shelled flat in a fortnight. Others held the front line for a year. When the guns moved on, Spain faced the same question in each place: rebuild or leave it in ruins. And then Franco answered it for them. 10 villages today, from Guadalajara to the Ebro. Stay through to number 1, because at Belchite, the dictator kept the ruins exactly as the war left them, as a monument to victory. It was the late summer of 1937, and the front in Aragon had become a row of villages waiting their turn. The armies fought from one church tower to the next, across ground that grew wheat, almonds, and very little else. We start small, with the one you would drive straight past. Number 10. Codo, in the province of Zaragoza. Drive south from the river, towards Belchite, and you pass a small village of pale stone, a low church, and a scatter of houses that look entirely unremarkable. That is rather the point of Codo. In 1937, it was a farming village of a few hundred people, growing wheat and olives on dry ground, the sort of place that had survived centuries precisely by being too small to matter. Its only strategic value was its position. It sat on the road the Republican army needed if it wanted to reach Belchite and break the Aragon front open in the Great Offensive of that August. A garrison of nationalist troops and local phalangists dug in among the houses, barricaded the church, and waited. They were not waited on for long. The Republicans could not push on to Belchite with Codo at their backs, so on the 24th of August, the village was surrounded and stormed. Taken over a day or two of close, room-by-room, fighting in temperatures well above 40 degrees. By the time it fell, the defenders were mostly dead or captured, and much of the village was rubble. The survivors who returned rebuilt around the wreckage rather than on top of it, which is why the older walls in Codo still carry the pockmarks and the gouges of a battle most history books do not bother to name. It is the kind of place that appears in the record only as a line on the way to somewhere worse. A village remembered, if at all, as the thing the army had to clear before the real killing started. And somewhere worse was exactly where the road went next. Number 9. Quinto, Zaragoza. Above the modern village of Quinto, on a bare hill overlooking the Ebro, there is an older Quinto that nobody lives in. A church with a fine mudhar tower, the old Church of the Assumption, stands roofless against the sky, surrounded by the foundations of houses that were emptied and never reoccupied. The town below is alive and ordinary, a working Aragonese village of a few thousand people. The town on the hill is a shell. Quinto was taken by the Republicans in the same August offensive of 1937 that consumed Codo and rolled towards Belchite, its defenders overwhelmed in a couple of days of hard fighting. For a few weeks afterwards, it became a forward base behind the line. The international brigades were quartered here that autumn, and the photographers of the 15th Brigade pointed their cameras at these streets and these faces, leaving some of the most reproduced images of the whole Aragon campaign. But the front does not reward a town for being useful. When the lines shifted and the war moved east towards the Ebro, the old hilltop town was left to fall apart while a new Quinto grew on flatter, safer ground below, closer to the road and the water. The result is two towns stacked on one hill, the living one at the bottom and the dead one at the top, separated by a short walk and the best part of a century. Climb to the old church at dusk, with the salt flats whitening the plain in the distance, and the Ebro Valley opens out beneath you, quiet now, with no hint of what once crossed it. From a single hill, the war widens out, because this was never about one village. It was a policy applied to a whole country. Number 8. Mediana de Aragon, Zaragoza. The hills above Mediana do not look like a battlefield. They look like grazing land, dry and gold in summer, scattered with low scrub and broken here and there by the pale crust of a salt lake. But walk them carefully, and the ground tells a different story, because it is still threaded with the collapsed lines of trenches dug in 1937. Mediana sat squarely on the Aragon front, and for months the village and the ridges around it were fought over by men who had come from a very long way to be there. In the October of 1937, the British battalion of the International Brigades held this line, dug into the heights, whilst other units pushed on towards Belchite, and an armoured attack went in nearby at Fuentes de Ebro. The village itself was battered, partly emptied, and slow to recover, caught for too long between two armies that were both content to leave it where it was. What makes Mediana strange is not a single dramatic ruin, but the opposite. It is an ordinary working village that happens to be ringed by the earthworks of a foreign army's war, the trenches and the gun positions softening into the hillside a little more with every winter that passes. This is where the story takes a turn most visitors miss. The grandest scars are not always the deepest ones. Sometimes the war does not flatten a place at all. It simply settles into the land around it and waits, year after year, to be noticed by anyone who knows what they are looking at. 200 miles to the west, the same year, the same policy was writing itself across a second front entirely. Number 7. Gajanejos, in the province of Guadalajara. If you walk through Gajanejos today, something will feel slightly wrong, and it takes a moment to place it. The houses are too similar. They line up in neat rows, the same arches, the same proportions, the same restrained doorways, as though the whole village had been printed rather than built over generations. There is a reason for that. The original Gajanejos was destroyed in the Battle of Guadalajara in the spring of 1937, when an Italian expeditionary force fighting for Franco drove towards Madrid through freezing rain and mud, and the Republicans turned it into one of their few clean victories of the war. The front ground back and forth across these villages north of the capital for the better part of a year, and the old parish church of San Pedro went with the rest. So when the new Gajanejos was raised in 1941, it was built in one piece by Franco's reconstruction agency, the Directorate General of Devastated Regions, which laid out the houses, the square, the town hall, and the homes for the priest and the schoolmaster, all to a single plan. That is what gives the place its oddly uniform, stamped-out look. A village designed in an office rather than grown on a hill. Behind the town hall, if you go looking, the older village still crumbles quietly away in fragments of the local style. The new church even copies the Romanesque shape of the one the war knocked down, a careful imitation of a building nobody now living ever prayed in. It is a village rebuilt as a memory of itself, faithful in outline and hollow at the heart. That reconstruction agency would leave its fingerprints on village after village. The next one it left almost empty. Number 6. Montarron, Guadalajara. Old Montarron was once a substantial place, a hill village of more than 550 people in its better years, with a lineage that ran back through the lords of Belchite and a branch of the great Mendoza family who once held the high ground above the valleys of the Sorba and the Henares. It guarded a real position. Then it had the bad fortune to sit on the front line north of Madrid, where it absorbed close to a year of near-daily bombardment, until there was very little left standing to bomb. The devastated region's agency built a new Montarron on the lower slope of the hill, tidy and modest, with arched doorways and space inside each house for the great clay jars the wine was kept in. And the people who came back to that. The old village above it was abandoned to the weather. Today, the new Montarron counts around 28 residents who still keep the old feast of Saint Sebastian going every January, with a costumed botarga capering through the streets, a thread of village life older than any war. And someone has put livestock pens among the ruins of the old village, so that sheep now graze through the roofless rooms of houses that once held a community 10 times the size of the one that survives below. It is a strange inheritance, a living village of less than 30 people keeping watch over the bones of the one that used to be. If you are finding these worth your time, subscribe, because there is a version of this for every front the war crossed, and the war crossed a great many. We are about to reach the 3 villages Franco refused to rebuild, and the last of them is the one he kept on purpose. The road from Montarron leads to the strangest of the Guadalajara 3, the one that was not abandoned and not rebuilt, but deliberately taken apart. Number 5, Valdeancheta, Guadalajara. Almost every ruined village on this list was left to fall down on its own. Valdeancheta was knocked down on purpose. After the front passed through and wrecked it in the same fighting north of Madrid, the surveyors who arrived decided the place was beyond saving, and for 2 years a work crew brought in from Espinosa de Henares and the villages around it methodically demolished what the war had started. They spared the shell of the church and the old combined town hall and school, both too far gone to use again, and flattened more or less everything else, clearing the rubble field by field. Here is the detail that gets lost in the bigger stories. A few years after the agency had packed up and gone, some of the original families came drifting back, not out of sentiment, but out of arithmetic, because their fields were still there even if their homes were not, and a field with no house is still a living. They built around 15 new houses lower down, on the ground where the wine cellars used to be dug into the slope. The church was never restored, neither was the school, which meant that for years the children of Valdeancheta walked the better part of an hour each way to lessons in the next village along, whatever the weather. It is the rare ghost village that died twice over, once by shell fire and once by demolition order, signed and carried out by the same state that claimed to be rebuilding the country, and then quietly, stubbornly, insisted on half living anyway. The 3 villages so far have something in common, and so does almost every place on this list. Each one stood on a front line and lost, but 3 of them were never rebuilt at all. Number 4, Brunete, in the province of Madrid. Brunete is the village that proves the pattern by breaking it. In July 1937, the Republicans launched a huge offensive here west of Madrid, throwing tens of thousands of men into open country to try to relieve the pressure on the capital. The fighting was savage, and the Castilian summer heat was worse, well past 40 degrees, with little water and less shade. Both sides poured in men and aircraft, until the village and the fields around it had been pounded into a wasteland. Brunete itself changed hands and was reduced to ruins. When Franco's counterattack closed the offensive down a few weeks later, the Republicans had suffered enormous losses for a sliver of ground they could not even hold. So far, this is the same story as all the others, a small place ground to nothing between 2 armies. But Brunete sat close to Madrid and carried real propaganda value, a name that had been in every newspaper in Europe. So Franco's regime chose to rebuild it completely, raising a brand new model village over the rubble and folding it back into ordinary life, as though the battle were something that could simply be tidied away and painted over. If every village had been treated like Brunete, rebuilt and smoothed over and quietly re-inhabited, this would be a much gentler list, a story about recovery. 3 of them were not treated like Brunete, and the last of those 3 was kept standing as an open wound on purpose by the man who won. Which brings us to the 3. Spain decided to leave exactly as the war found them. Number 3. Roden, Zaragoza. Remember the question from the start. Rebuild or leave it in ruins? Roden is the place where you can stand between both answers at once. Below, a small modern village of perhaps 20 people, now no more than a neighbourhood of the larger town of Fuentes de Ebro, a few kilometres away. Above it, on a hilltop, the gutted remains of old Roden, with the broken church and the ruined Moorish-era castle that finally lost a wall one winter in 2016, simply collapsing under its own age and neglect. Before the war, this was a village of barely 200 souls, ancient enough that its name may run all the way back to a Roman settlement called Rudius. The front of 1937 rolled straight over it, and the villagers fled as the lines drew close, swept up in the same offensive that took Codo and Quinto. The locals call it the Little Belchite, and the comparison is fair because afterwards the very same choice was made here as there. The old village on the hill was abandoned to ruin, and the devastated Regions Agency built a new one at its foot, just a church, 10 houses, the schoolmaster's home, and the school. But some families would not let go so easily. A handful clung on in the broken shells of the old houses until as late as 1960, raising children in the bones of a bombed village with the war still standing all around them. Spain only formally protected Old Roden as a historic monument in 2017, which is to say it spent the best part of 80 years simply being left alone on its hill. The piano, if there ever was one, is long gone. The silence is not. 2 of the 3 are behind us now. The largest and the most decisive is still ahead. Number 2, Corbera d'Ebro in Catalonia, and its old town, the Poble Vell. High on the hill of La Montarron, the old town of Corbera looks down on the new one, and the difference between them is the whole war in a single view. The streets up top are roofless. The 18th century church of Saint-Père, built in the Baroque style on the site of an older Romanesque one, stands open to the weather, its tower scarred, propped and sheltered now, under a protective roof, but never truly repaired. There is a reason this place is studied to this day, and visited by people from every country that sent men here. Corbera stood directly on the front line of the Battle of the Ebro, the longest and bloodiest battle of the entire war, which ran for 115 days from the 25th of July to the middle of November in 1938, after the Republicans threw a whole army across the river in the dark. Before it began, around 2,500 people lived in this wine-growing corner of the Terra Alta. The town lost a third of them. Aerial bombing and artillery ground the upper village to ruins over those long months, and when it was finally over, the survivors rebuilt below rather than return to the hill. Then comes the part that lands hardest. The old town was not emptied in 1938. The very last residents only left the Poble Vell in 2008. 70 years. 70 years of a stubborn handful living on in a town the war had already killed. Today, the regional government runs it as a place of memory, with a single stark word, terror, set on a cross among the ruins. and an alphabet of sculpted stone letters threading through the streets, placed there in the 1990s, so that what happened on this hill would have to be spelled out letter by letter rather than quietly forgotten. Which leaves the one village that the dictator who won the war decided the whole country should be made to look at. Number 1. Belchite. In the province of Zaragoza, 45 kilometers southeast of the city itself. You walk in through a gate that carries the words memory and peace, and then the modern world ends. Ahead of you are streets of shell-torn buildings, collapsed roofs, a clock tower hanging on by habit, and the gutted churches with their mudéjar brickwork still showing through the damage. Nobody has fixed any of it. That is not neglect. That is the design. Belchite was an old Aragonese town of around 3,500 people when the war found it. In late August 1937, the Republican Army threw itself at the place, and the nationalist defenders, with the water cut off and the August heat unbearable, held the streets house by house. The siege ran from the 24th of August to the 7th of September. When it ended, the Republicans held a town that barely existed anymore, and estimates of the dead and wounded on both sides run to around 5,000. Worse, the offensive that cost so much stalled anyway. Within a year, Franco's forces had taken Belchite back and gone on to win the war. Then the dictator made his decision. He ordered that the ruined town never be repaired. A new Belchite would be built alongside it, raised over more than a decade, from 1940 to 1954, much of the labour done by captured Republican prisoners. And the shattered old town would be left standing, untouched, as a monument. The official story was that it stood for the suffering of his own side. The real message was simpler and colder. This is what the losers did. I gave you new homes. Do not forget who won. The propaganda has long since curdled. The regime is gone, the dictator died in his bed, and the ruins he meant as a boast have become something he would have hated. A plain and unbranded record of what war does to a town full of people who only wanted the fighting to be somewhere else. The walls do not take sides. They simply stand there, scarred, and let you draw the conclusion. There are places in Spain you cannot visit because they were demolished by order. There are places you cannot visit because the front passed through and the people built somewhere new. And there is one place you can visit only because a dictator wanted it kept as a warning and got, in the end, a warning aimed squarely back at him. 10 villages today, and the same question running under all of them. From the trenches above Mediana to the gate at Belchite. Rebuild or leave it in ruins? Spain answered it 10 different ways, and you can still walk through every answer. I have stood in a couple of these now, and I will tell you the part that surprised me. The ruins are not the sad places. You expect the ruins to be grim. It is the tidy new villages next door, the uniform rows of houses built by the losing side under guard that stay with you on the drive home. There are more of these, there are always more. Subscribe and we will find the next 10 together. Thank you.